So, in this video, we will see development of what we call in modern India tribal resistance. Very important area for our preliminary examination, and there is a tendency to ask question related to tribal resistance even in the main examination, right. So, we will discuss in this video tribal resistance, tribal revolt also you can say, tribal resistance or tribal revolt. Preliminary point of view important because they give you some revolt, they ask you about their leader, sometime they can give you a matching test question regarding the year of the tribal revolt, but they generally ask very popular tribal revolt when they ask year or the leaders. But when they ask you to match the area, suppose this tribal revolt related to Jharkhand or Odisha or Bengal, so they ask some typical tribal revolts also. Sometime they can give you 4 tribal revolt and you have to arrange them in order, right. So, they will give you 4 tribal revolt and you have to arrange them in chronological order. This kind of question they ask in tribal revolt. It is a factual topic, no doubt about it, and modern historian, particularly the subaltern historians, they worked very hard on this tribal resistance. They generally say that there are around 70 tribal resistance, 70 around from 1760s to 1947. So, there is a list, K. Suresh Singh, then there is a historian called Mahapatra. So, they all worked on this tribal resistance. So, there is a tendency to ask question in preliminary examination, but they can also ask you question in main examination, like what were the main reasons behind these revolts. They can ask you who motivated the tribals for such revolts. They can ask you how they fought their enemies. They can ask you what kind of sacrifice they, you can say, made, or they had to make, So, this kind of question they can raise. They have not asked, they can ask, Then finally, they can ask you that what was the result or the consequences of these reaction, whether they played important role in, you can say, expelling the British forces from India, whether they played important role in our national movement or they were only interested in protecting their own culture. I hope you are getting it. They have probably asked a question regarding the nature of tribal revolt. Nature also they have asked. So, this kind of question they can ask about tribal revolt. So, I said for our examination point of view, for main examination, for main, you should remember causes of this tribal revolt. Then they can ask you about the nature of this tribal revolt, nature. There are different opinion, categorization, types, nature of the tribal revolt. Then they can ask you about the, you can say, any example they can ask you, and the impact or the significance they can ask you, significance they can ask you. So, overall this kind of tribal resistance, or if you have heard about this term, we are also saying it is history from below, history from below. Is it okay? So, in main examination they can ask you this kind of question, and for main examination there is no need to remember those different examples. But in preliminary examination, for preliminary examination, for PT, preliminary test, you have to remember examples, and I told you that there are 70 listed tribal revolts, so we cannot remember 70 listed, but we can remember around 15 to, right, you can say 20, right, the tribal revolts, main tribal revolts for our preliminary examination. Particularly, right, the causes would be more or less same, but right, the significance would be more or less same. Only you can say the area, year, right, would be the, you can say, different, right. So we have to remember, and once you are familiar with it, you can handle it. You will see the choice and you can remember it. So there is no there is no worry, right, that you will remember it or not. Once you are familiar with this, it is difficult. They can come out with some new tribal revolt also, but believe me that if you remember all those old tribal revolt which have, I can say, which are mentioned in our textbook, we can easily handle, right, that question. Is this fine? So I hope now you know what is the topic, what kind of question they can ask, right. Generally there is a tendency to ignore this topic, factual, but believe me that this kind of topic, even in the main examination, if they ask, there is a possibility of asking, you can say there is a possibility of asking question from that, and you will get good marks. When they ask factual question, that if you you can say reproduce that, right, so there is a possibility of good marks. So therefore we should always remember it for main examination also. But yes, examples we have to revise. Is this okay? Done. So tribal revolt, very important from the subaltern school, right, point of view. We call this subaltern school as history from below. So there is a tendency to highlight more, right, this kind of tribal revolt. So we are working on this kind of tribal revolt. Well, now, so what we will do, first we can discuss some important, right, the causes of this tribal revolt. When we discuss causes of the tribal revolt, I told you that there are some general opinion. What is general opinion? General opinion is that the colonial, right, you can say administration, the colonial administration, right, ended, right, their relative isolation. This is the one important opinion, general cause, that the colonial administration ended their relative isolation. They started interfering, they started disturbing them, they had a fear from outsiders, either contractors or traders or the missionaries, and therefore they revolted against outsiders. I hope you are getting it. So general opinion is that they revolted because of this interference, because colonial administration, British administration ended their relative isolation. But there are different opinion, as I told you, different historian working on different tribal revolt, and they had different opinion, and they say no, in some tribal revolt this was the main factor, right, in second tribal revolt this was the main factor, but overall this factor contributed. So when you are writing about it, causes of the tribal revolts, overall we can mention in introduction that how the colonial administration ended, right, their relative isolation, and that was the main factor. And right, you can talk about some of the economic policies, educational, cultural, social policies of the colonial administration which actually ended their relative isolation. But there are some opinion about some different, they can say, tribal revolts, so we can also elaborate. So we can add that according to some historian, this revolt was against, right, against extension of British rule to their areas, So when British rule extended to their areas, they revolted, right, they revolted. And right, there are different examples for it. Is this okay? So this is also one important opinion. Second, or the next opinion is that their resentment was against penetration of against penetration of their areas, right, penetration of their areas, right, against penetration of their areas by outsiders, right. In some of the revolt they use the term Dikus. You would be familiar with it if you are from eastern areas. Dikus, outsiders. So they penetrated into their areas, so therefore they were against it. Who were those outsiders? They said they were money lenders, they were money lenders, they were traders, they were contractors, right. Some police officials also, for maintaining law and order also, they penetrated into their areas. So they were called outsiders, money lenders, traders, contractors, and therefore they revolted, resentment against them. Fine. Then some historian, they believe that they revolted against the tightening of control, by the British officials, right, over forest zones, right. So they had their own, you can say, laws. Now new forest law started interfering, so they started reacting against the tightening of control by the British officials over their forest zones. Why? For revenue purpose, right, for revenue purposes. It is okay. So therefore you will see that they started reacting, interference, right. Well, so these are some opinion, like they reacted against extension of British rule to their areas. They reacted against the penetration of the outsiders, money lenders, traders, contractors, Dikus. Then they reacted against the tightening of control by the British officials over forest zones for revenue purpose. Then some historian also added that they also reacted, right, because of the activities of the against the activities of, right, the Christian missionaries, against the Christian, you can say, missionaries, against the Christian missionaries. So they reacted against the Christian missionaries in their areas, right. Very popular revolt, you must be knowing it. So they asked this question in 2020, right, against Mundas. You can say Munda revolt against Christian missionaries, right, against the activities of Christian missionaries. So there is also one opinion. Then there is also, right, one opinion that they reacted against the British effort to recruit to recruit, right, unpaid tribal labor, tribal labor. So they were, treated like a bonded kind of labor. So they were involved, right, they were given some work and right. So some work, and because of that, right, they started reacting because there was no payment and of course interference. So this kind of opinion also by some historian, right. Then there is a opinion, like one more opinion if we can remember, according to one historian, that their resentment, resentment, right, was against British efforts, to right, suppress certain tribal traditions. Their resentment against British efforts to suppress certain tribal tradition. Why? Because the progressive British force realized that these traditions are backward. We decided what is backward, what is not backward. Some of their tradition considered against the norms of progressive societies, right. For example, right, human sacrifice among Khonds, right, are you aware? So there is a very popular, you can say, this tradition of human sacrifice, right, among the Khonds, right, Khonds, they revolted in 1840s. So Khonds of Odisha. So human sacrifice, and they wanted to ban it, of course, right, because it was against the norms of the progressive societies, Khonds. So they revolted, right. So there was a reaction against this kind of suppression of their own, right, among the Khonds, right, Khonds, they revolted in 1840s. So Khonds of Odisha. So human sacrifice, and they wanted to ban it, of course, right, because it was against the norms of the progressive societies, Khonds. So they revolted, right. So there was a reaction against this kind of suppression of their own tradition also, right. So these are some important views, some important points to suggest that why, or you can say, tribal revolt. Overall, I told you, you should always remember that the colonial administration ended their isolation, right. And as you know that tribal, when you say that, isolation is very important, right. Tribal, when you say the word tribal, it's a group, right, and they started reacting, and they realized that they are the worst victims of the colonial rule. Fine, I hope that with, you can say, these points you can handle why tribal revolt. There are many opinions, but still we are working on this kind of, right, areas. Now there is a debate among the historian regarding the different types or the nature of this tribal revolt, different views, and on the basis of nature of this tribal revolt, right, different historian divided tribal revolts into different categories, right. So there is a 3 type view, there is a 4 type opinion, right, there are 5 type opinion. So there are different historian, different views regarding their type, right. Generally, right, we accept what is called the 3 type tribal reaction, 3 type classification. So we can add that generally it is believed that there are 3 types of tribal revolt, three types of tribal, there are three types of tribal revolts, right. They can ask you this, three types of tribal revolt. First type is called reactionary. First type is called reactionary, right. Reactionary tribal revolt. What is reactionary tribal revolt? So, we can add that it attempted to oppose reform. It attempted to oppose reform, political or social. It attempted to oppose reform, right. Why? Because they considered that these so called reform is a non-tribal feature, So, therefore, they reacted. So, they attempted to oppose reform, right, and these reactionary kind of a revolt or this kind of tendency was mostly seen among the tribals living a simple and isolated life, generally in forest. So, they reacted, they attempted to oppose the so called reform, political or the social, and whenever they saw alien groups, outsiders, right, whenever they saw alien groups, right, creating change, or you can say creating difference in their life, obstacles in their life, they became offensive and they tried to bring back what? The old golden days. You will see that many example. They now started remembering their old golden days. They wanted to bring back their old golden days against, you can say, right, this kind of alien groups, outsiders, non-tribals, and they reacted. So, most of the historians, they consider this kind of tribal revolt as reactionary tribal revolt. Is it okay? But you can say some historian, right, I said that they are not using the word reactionary, they said, right, you can say the second type or the second, right, the category, they use the word conservative type, right, second type. And why conservative? They opposed change, right, we can say that the conservative, why? Because they opposed change. Whatever they had, they wanted to continue change in their tribal life, and they sought to maintain status quo, right. So, some of the historians, they use the word conservative, right. So, they were reactionary, then second they were conservative, right. So, about the nature of the tribal revolt, this kind of word, right, is used. Then there is a third, you can say, category, what you call revolutionary, type. Sometime, right, some historian use the word revivalistic, revivalistic or revolutionary type, right. So, they were revolutionary. Why? Because they aimed to replace, certain traits, of their traditional, right, you can say culture, You have this kind of, right, revolt also, right. So, they aim to replace certain traits of traditional culture. They use this opportunity, right, and we can add the leaders of this kind of tribal revolt, they sought to purify, right, certain elements of culture, right. So, we have this kind of classification also, but you will not see this kind of analysis in your NCERTs, because still there is a confusion, right, regarding use of this kind of term. Still there is a confusion, right. Some historians say that no, this right, you cannot say that one tribal revolt was only a revolutionary. Sometime you will see the same tribal revolt was revolutionary also, revivalistic also, right, sometime a reformist also, right. So, you will see that different kind of views, and in one tribal revolt also the same kind of nature you can see. So, one tribal revolt was conservative also, and sometimes reactionary also, revolutionary also, revivalist also. So, very difficult to categorize on, right, you can say these lines. So, there is a criticism also. I hope you are getting it, but I wanted to tell you that these are the terms used by some historians, right, some anthropologists, right, to divide this tribal revolt, but there are still different opinion. Some historian, right, suggest that no, this kind of classification we cannot use, right, and they say that generally we should divide the tribal revolt into 4 categories, 4 types. So, the second, right, basis, or the second right, view is that there are 4 types of tribal revolt. First is agrarian tribal revolt, right, agrarian tribal revolt, which was agriculture based, which was forest law based agrarian. Second category was they were demanding political autonomy, mostly you will see in the frontier, in the northeast frontier area, right, you will see that there was, right, demand of political autonomy. So, this is the second category. Third category was they were actually revolting or the reacting because of the influence of Sanskritization. Sanskritization is a word used by M.N. Srinivas, right. So, Professor M.N. Srinivas, those who have sociology, they must be knowing M.N. Srinivas, Professor M.N. Srinivas, Sanskritization. So, some tribal revolt because of, right, reaction, because of the mobility factor, Sanskritization. They wanted to, right, you can say the follow the norms of the higher, upper, you can say category of the people, class of people, or the caste of people, right. So, Sanskritization influenced them, Sanskritization. Then the fourth category, they say that it was, right, only a cultural, right, reaction, and it was mainly for their own script, because their script was in danger, their language was in danger. So, therefore, these tribal revolts were, right, you can say mainly cultural movement. Fine. Well, you are getting it. So, these are some of the important words, and of course, when you think about these, you would be in a better position to analyze these tribal revolts. So, well, now you have sufficient idea regarding the causes of tribal revolt to handle 150 words question, and then of course, if they ask you that nature of tribal revolt, so there are different opinion about their nature. You can use these words and you can handle it, right. But you will understand these tribal revolts better when you can remember some important examples of these tribal revolts. Examples of this tribal revolt. Is this fine? Of course, it would be some it would be a boarding exercise also to remember these names, but believe me that if you can revise this 10-12 tribal revolts properly, you can remember it, right. So, examples of these tribal revolts. See, one concept here what you can remember, that tribal revolt started in 18th century only, right. Tribal revolt started just after the foundation of British rule. You remember 1757 Palasi. After that, you can see tribal revolt in 1760s, 70s, 80s. So, tribal revolt started in 18th century and it continued in 19th century. It continued in 19th century and even it continued even in the 20th century. Right. And when you reach this phase, Gandhian phase, you can see some change in the nature of tribal revolt. Change in the nature of tribal revolt. Why? Now you will see they were more influenced by Gandhian movement. It is very interesting, Gandhian movement. Now tribals affected by Gandhian Satyagraha, you will see many Gandhi emerged among tribals, right. In Andhra area also you will see, in the northeast also you will see, among Nagas also you will see that influence of Gandhian movement, right, in tribal revolt. So, when you take up these example and in case they ask you, right, question even in the main examination, you can arrange, right, these tribal revolts like this. Is this okay? Now, for our preliminary examination, we should remember some tribal revolt, and wherever it is required, leaders, their leaders, their area, right, and causes were more or less same. They were against those interference by colonial forces. Now, so we can remember some tribal revolts. So, whenever, like when you remember some tribal revolts, I told you, you start, right, from 18th century. So, now take up some example, take some example of tribal revolt. So, first example of tribal revolt is what you call Chuar uprising in Bengal area. Chuar uprising in Bengal area, Midnapur area, and they started revolting in 1760s, and if they ask you one date, so 1776. So, 60s they started revolting, Chuar uprising, and why they started reacting in 1760s? Because the Bengal famine of 1760 influenced them, and they were reacting against enhanced revenue demand, right. So, they started reacting. Is this fine? So, generally like you will see this is considered as the first tribal reaction, Chuar in Bengal, right. Then second tribal reaction you can remember is Paharias. Paharias, right, they also revolted in the present day Jharkhand area you can say, but in examination they will ask you Raj Mahal hill areas, Paharias, Raj Mahal hill areas, Paharias, and they revolted in 1778 against British extension in their areas, against British extension in their areas, Paharias. So, Chuar and then Paharias. It is a matter of only 2-3 revision. You can remember it. I am organizing it, right. I am highlighting it, and you have to remember, and right, we can handle it. And as I told you, sometimes they give you 4 revolt and you have to arrange them in order. So, I am trying to follow order, so that even if you do not remember the date, exact date, you can arrange them. Okay, first was Chuar, then was Pahadia, like that, right. Okay, done. So, Pahadias. Then third important tribal reaction, was coal reaction. Third important tribal reaction was coal reaction in the Chota Nagpur area. So, still in the Jharkhand area, Chota Nagpur area, coal and coal uprising, right, in 1831. Coal uprising in 1831-32, you can remember 1831-32, and the leader of this coal uprising was Buddho Bhagat. I am mentioning the name of Buddho Bhagat because they have already asked it, right. So, Buddho Bhagat you have to remember, and why they reacted, why these coals reacted, because there was transfer of land, right, to outsiders, even Muslim Sikhs, right, they were given the land of that area in 1830s, so they started reacting, right. And coal reaction are important because even there was some military action also against them, so therefore they reacted. Is it okay? So, you should remember this coal reaction, right. Even those why I am saying that you should remember it, because some area which are given even in the optional syllabus, history optional syllabus, we generally, right, teach these areas detail, right, coal and all. So, as this is a part of history optional also, so there is a tendency to ask it, right. So, in history optional, right, they have not mentioned Chuar or Paharia, but they have mentioned coal. So, in GS also they can ask you coal, just giving you a hint, probably they can ask coal uprising. Then the fourth, right, the next we can remember Ahom revolt. Right. Ahom revolt also same period, you can, if you have to arrange, you should arrange before it, right. So, 1828 onward, 28 to 32 or 33, Ahom revolt, and Ahom revolt in Assam area, Ahom territory, Assam area, and the leader was Gomadhar Konwar. right. So, Ahom revolt they have already probably asked even in general studies. So, date or the leader Ahom revolt. Why? Because there was a attempt to incorporate this territory, right, you can say into the British territory, and the revolt is part of, right. So, Ahom revolt. Then the next revolt we can mention fifth, right. So, next revolt was Khasi also in the northeast, Khasi revolt. So, Khasi revolt very popular, Khasi hills, Assam, Meghalaya, right, in 1829-30, right, 32, and the leader was Tirath Singh, then Bar Manik, right, Tirath Singh and Bar Manik, and again occupation of their areas, that was the main factor for their revolt, occupation of their area, Khasi revolt. Okay. Then the next tribal revolt that we should remember is the Bhils, right. So, there are two type of Bhils, one was that the Maharashtra area Bhil, and the second was the Rajasthan area Bhil. So, initially there was reaction in the right so called the new area Maharashtra area, Khandes area, so exactly right, Khandes area, part of Maharashtra, Khandes area, the Bhil revolted, and they started revolting after 1818. They started revolting in 1818 and they continued till 1848. So, when they ask you this kind of Bhil revolt, it is difficult to organize them in order, because they continued for around 30 years, right, in Khandes Maharashtra area, right. And there was, right, there is a opinion that they were also reacting because of that, right, Anglo-Maratha, third Anglo-Maratha war. So, they were, you can say, encouraged by Peshwa Bajirao too. So, this kind of opinion is also there, right. So, Bhil's revolt you can remember. Then after Bhil revolt, we can remember next tribal revolt, we can remember Kolis of Gujarat, Maharashtra, Sahyadri Hills, Kolis. They reacted. They started reacting in 1820s, continued to 1840s, Kolis. And when there is a confusion, exact date is not there, so they will not ask the date. That is okay, right? That you have to remember. Kolis, 1820s to 1840s, right? In the Gujarat, Maharashtra area, Sahyadri Hills. Then next revolt was Koyas or Kondadoras, Koyas or Kondadoras, and this was in the Andhra area, the Godavari region, Godavari region, and one of the, you can say, leader was Kora Malaya, right, Kora Malaya. He considered himself as one of the Pandyas, Kora Malaya. Right. So, they, most of them, they had their own idea. They started trying to link their leadership with some mythological character. This kind of analysis also you will see. Koyas or Kondadora of Godavari region of Andhra Pradesh, right. And Kondadora ya Koyas revolt was in the 1840s, continued even in the 20th century also it continued, Kondadora. Then you have a very popular revolt, and they have asked question is Santhal revolt, Santhal. So, for GS point of view, it is the most important, Santhal revolt, right, Santhal revolt in 1855-56, Bipin Chandra highlighted this Santhal revolt. Most of the writers who visited this area, they talked about their heroism, like LSSO Meli, right, LSSO Meli, right, talked about the heroism of Santhal revolt. So, Santhal revolt of 1855-56 is the most important area, and it is also called Santhal Hul, Hul, H-O-O-L, Hul, and this revolt was in again Rajmahal Hills, Rajmahal Hills, and this area was called Damane Koh, Damane Koh area, Damane Koh area, Santhal revolt. Is it okay? And they were against Dikus, they were against outsiders, and right, they were against the ill treatment, you can say, at the hands of revenue officers, operation of the police, extortion of the landlord, money lenders, right. So, and interesting thing, I told you that they were so aggressive, violent, that government had to use military, right. So, military action was there to suppress them. So, before the revolt of 1857, Santhal revolt was one of the important tribal revolt, right. So, I already mentioned something about Santhal revolt earlier also, but again, right, 2-3 points you should remember, right, as we are discussing tribal revolt separately. Then we can remember Naikda revolt, Naikdas, 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 Naikda revolt in the Gujarat area, Naikda area in 1858 onward, Naikda 58, 1860, right. So, Naikda revolt, Gujarat, Maharashtra area, led by Roop Singh, right, Roop Singh and Jodia Bhagat. Roop Singh and Jodia Bhagat, right. And Santhal revolt leader, you must be knowing, there are many leaders like Chand, Bhairav, Sidho, Kanho, right. So, those at least Sidho and Kanho you can remember, they can ask Sidho and Kanho, right, Kanho. Okay. And then Naikdas, Roop Singh, Jodia Bhagat, you can remember Naikdas. Then after Naikdas you have, right, you can say in the Assam area, Kacha Nagas, in the Assam area, and one of the leader associated with it was a very, you can say, a kind of miracle man, right. His name was Sambhudan, right. Well, they can ask you that, they can give you the name of the revolt, then you have to relate the, you can say, leaders like this. Then after that, when the Kacha Naga revolted, in 1880s, 82, Kacha Nagas. Then after Kacha Naga, very popular revolt, right, called Mundas. Munda, very important. Munda revolt, right, Munda revolt 1899, 1900, right. Munda of Jharkhand, Chota Nagpur area, Mundas, they revolted, and they were called Ul Gulan, right. Munda revolt were called Ul Gulan, Santhal revolt were called Hul. So Mundas Ulgulan, and why they revolted? Because of the erosion of their land revenue system, what you call Khutkati system, Khutkati system. It was their land, you can say, revenue system, and they were also against the forced labor. They were also against forced labor, right? And they were, you can say, right, they wanted again that golden era back. So they started treating Birsa as a god, right? So in Jharkhand area, right? So Birsa still considered as a god. So Ulgulan, you can remember, it's a very popular and very very effective kind of tribal reaction. Then after Mundas, right, I said in the Rajasthan Bhils also reacted. Rajasthan Bhils also reacted, mostly in the Dungarpur area, areas in the 20th century, 1912-13. Rajasthan Bhils also they reacted. Later, 1920s, they were led by Motilal Tejawat. So this kind of information, right, gradually you will be learning. So Rajasthan Bhils also reacted, and then during, when you say the 1914-15 very popular revolt in Jharkhand called Oraon revolt. Oraon revolt, very popular. They have not asked probably this, they can ask you Oraon revolt, 1914-15, and they were led by very popular name. Remember these two names. They were led by Jatra Bhagat and Tana Bhagat. Sometimes it is called Tana Bhagat movement. Tana Bhagat. Right, Tana Bhagat. Right, and right, different kind of feature, typical feature, abstention from eating meat, liquor, you can say, return to shifting cultivation, all those issues were there in this Oraon revolt. So it is important, 1914-15 Oraon revolt. Then after that you have one revolt very popular in Manipur area, right, it is called Kukis, very popular revolt, right, 1917-19, Kuki revolt, and one Naga leader Jado Nang was also later associated with it, Jado Nang, Kukis. Is it okay? Kukis. And then in the same area you will see that in 1930s during civil disobedience movement, right, Rani Gadenliu, very popular tribal leader, Gadenliu, very popular name, right, Rani Gadenliu. So these kind of reaction you have, this kind of reaction we have, tribal revolt. But apart from that, right, some less known tribal revolt also, if you can remember, it would be better. Like there was called Bhuang, BH, right, BHUAN, Bhuan, and Juang, JUANG, Bhuan and Juang revolt. It started in 1860s, continued till 90s. Bhuang and Juang revolt in Keonjhar area, Odisha. Bhuan and Juang revolt, you can remember Bhuang and Juang revolt, you can remember. Then you can remember, right, Chenchus, CHENCHUS, Chenchus revolt of Andhra area, Chenchus, right. It was in 1920s during non-cooperation days, Chenchus. And then in 1940s, there was a revolt by, you can say, Gonds in the Chhattisgarh, present day Chhattisgarh area, Gonds of Chhattisgarh also. So who knows, like they can ask you Gonds also, right. Then there are some revolt in the frontier area, and their nature was different because they demanded political autonomy. So in the frontier tribes in the northeast frontier area, in the frontier areas also we have idea, right, about some revolt, tribal revolt, like in 1836, Miss Mees, right, in the northeast frontier area. Then you will see that after 1836 you have some revolt like Khampti, Khampti, Khampti in the Assam area, Khampti. Then if you can remember Lusai, right, Lusai revolt, Lushais, Lusai's revolt, right. Then you have Singpho, Singhpho, Singpho revolt, right, it was in 1840s, Singpho revolt, right, Singpho in Assam, right. So then you have in the Tripura also some revolt, Tripura uprising in 1860s, Tripura uprising. So of course, like there are many tribal revolts, but whatever we mentioned, at least this you should revise very properly. And they have the tendency to ask question related to Santhal revolt, that what happened after Santhal revolt. Santhal Pargana was created. They had to accept their demand because they could not, right, continue this kind of reaction, right. So most of the tribal revolt, whatever they demanded, right, they had to, right, particularly, right, in the 19th century, they had to accept it because they realized that, right, it would be difficult to handle them, right. So they played important role, and as I told you, in 1920s and 30s they were guided by Gandhian movement, non-cooperation movement, civil disobedience movement, Quit India movement. So they also created pressure on British forces, colonial forces. So what was the overall impact? They played important role in arousing national consciousness, right. They also came under the nationalist influence, and they were not only fighting for their own cause, they were also guided by, right, their, you can say, our nationalism also, particularly in the Gandhian phase. So I hope that whatever we discussed in tribal